You are listening to Gospel of Peace, a podcast for kingdom women and everyone else about political theology and everyday faith. I'm your host, Rebecca. I'm the editor of the Kingdom Outpost, kingdomoutpost.org, and I'm a PhD student exploring how the gospel of peace transforms us in a world of abuse, nationalism, violence, empire, and more. Welcome back, everyone. Today, we are diving straight into a really challenging subject, and it's a subject that's challenging for me as well. I talk about Anabaptist theology on this podcast. I reference the Anabaptist vision, and I talk about how it's not like some niche, weird theology for some special group of people. It really is, it's a historical movement. That's why I refer to it as Anabaptism. But really, it's about wanting to be a follower of Jesus, wanting to be like Jesus, and centering Jesus's word and teaching and example, right? And so, what happens when Anabaptists as a group and the belief system, which includes nonviolence, is put to the test? In recent news, there have been cases of really a culture surrounding abuse that harms survivors, that emphasizes like performative forgiveness, that does honestly more harm than good and does not reflect nonviolence. Why? Because in many cases, this weaponization of forgiveness really serves to create a predator's paradise where abusers know that no matter what they do, there will always be people who will want to try and redeem them, who want to forgive over and over and over again, who want to, people with like a deep narcissism, with deep like desire to do harm, whether it's domestic violence or sexual abuse, which we'll be talking about today. So content warning about that. Those who want to get away with it, who want to groom not just victims, but also groom an environment. Anabaptist churches and Anabaptist communities have somehow been places that abusers see as safe. And honestly, a place that is safe for wolves cannot be safe for sheep. If we are an unsafe community, then we have lost sight of what it means to have a good shepherd, to be Jesus's flock, because Jesus's flock must always be a safe place. So that is what we're here to talk about. This is in recent news. I also wrote an article on it that I will be referencing, and another book that has been published that I will be talking about as well in a little bit. And the reason why this is so important to talk about is because fundamentally, as a principle, Anabaptists do not believe that there is any belief system that can sound good on paper on its own, and that it should be accepted for just that, an abstract theory, a belief system. It's as if you take your doctrine, your theology, your creed, even if it's nonviolence or if it's something else like systematic theology, and you cannot say it exists up here or it exists in the abstract or in some spiritual realm or as words, as ideas. It can never exist as an idea according to Anabaptism or according to historical Anabaptists. It has to be lived out. It has to be existential. It has to be embodied. It has to be real. Then only it is existed. And I mean, Jesus said, "You shall know them by your fruit." This is a Jesus teaching, basically. He said, "Be doers of the word and not just hearers only." I mean, let's take, for example, truth. Truth does not exist in the abstract. Truth is a person, and person is Jesus. That person is God. God embodies truth. Same with love. Love is not just a thing that exists as an abstract idea, as a philosophy. God is love. right? And so the same thing with theology. There's no separation of the material, physical, lived out community, reality, and some kind of like perfect, pure theology that you can lock into a safe. So no matter how harmful or abusive a church or community may be like, but it's good in theory. No, if it's not lived out, then that theory is suspect. Things cannot exist merely as a framework of ideas. That is very much an enlightenment concept where you have this framework of perfect ideas, this formula, and everything makes sense and it's logical. And then that's it. It exists in the theoretical realm. It exists in the realm of the mind. According to Jesus, if it is not embodied, it doesn't exist. Now, you may say we have the true doctrine, we have the true way of following Jesus, but if you don't live it out, what's the point, right? The formula, the framework, the ideas can be suspect if we don't live them out. Why? Because even the most abusive, the most harmful churches and theologies, churches can have so-called good theologies that sound biblical, that use lots of proof texts that sound good on paper. A lot of abusive, like cult theologies, like Gothard's theology, it sounds very good on paper. I mean, they're not openly teaching immorality. They're not openly teaching abuse. On paper, it sounds really good. It sounds really beneficial for everyone involved. It sounds really loving. Reality is, something is only as good as its fruit. That's what Jesus said. It's only as good as the way that it is lived out. And the challenge for Anabaptists there is that they believe that there's no such thing as a pure, perfect, true, like truly interpreted theology in theory. As I was thinking about this and planning for the podcast, something that came to mind was the fact that Jesus is the Logos. So we talk about, say, theology, doctrine, truth, right? Truth is the Logos, Logos being the Word of God. If we say we believe in the Word of God, we're Christians, then we have to believe that the Logos, that truth, does not exist as an idea. The word became flesh and dwelt among us, which means that it took on breathing form. And the way that the Logos comes to life is in the church community. If there is no church community living out the truth of Jesus's teachings, then for all intents and purposes, to everyone looking in from the outside, Christianity, like truth, doesn't, the truth of what we believe does not exist if we don't embody it. That's why Jesus said, by this all men shall know that you are my disciples, that you love one another. If that love is not existent within us, then why do we believe that it exists? Sure, we believe that God is love and God is truth and that exists, but we have to embody it. We have to make it real. We have to live and breathe it in our communities, which is why community is so important. That's why faith does not exist as an idea. Faith must be found in community, in a faith community, in people, loving one another, caring for one another. And so that is the Logos. Like, that is the very idea of the Logos, a word that is made flesh and embodied. And because Anabaptists believe this according to scripture and according to Jesus' teachings, you shall know them by their fruit. This means that nonviolence, peace theology, doesn't exist as a mere theory. It can be called into question no matter how good it sounds if a community does not live up to this reality. And so I'm going to read to you a little bit from Dr. Gerald Mast's new article. And he has a new series in an Anabaptist publication. Let me just get the name of that publication for you. It is Pennsylvania Mennonite Heritage. This was published in the July 2023 edition, and this is part of a series called Menno Simons' Life and Development of 5 Key Theological Premises and Practices of True Evangelical Faith. And this is like a 5-part series. The first article here is called Recovering True Evangelical Faith, How Menno Corrects the Anabaptist Vision. And one of the things that Dr. Maas talks about is the fact that Anabaptism has never been perfect. And to me, that's a good thing. So Harold Bender's Anabaptist vision really strongly emphasized the early Swiss brethren. And he did that as a corrective because many people think of Anabaptists as being the violent Munster rebels and the Dutch apocalyptic Anabaptists who did call themselves Anabaptists, but who practiced violence, who were the sword bearers. And there were always staff bearers, namely the nonviolent Anabaptists, but there were the sword bearers as well during the late 1500s, I think it was, in the Munster Rebellion. And Bender sort of takes us back to the Swiss brethren who started in 1525, and he goes, well, we just need to focus on this, and we need to emphasize that there's this clear, unbroken line of people who truly practice peace. The fact is that it's more complicated than that. There's never actually been a perfect Anabaptist group that we don't have anything to criticize about. Just as there's no faith that we have, like no church community, no group of people that we have nothing to criticize about. I think that we need to realize that everybody is up for criticism, but today is not about like comparing Anabaptists versus everyone else and saying that they're better or that they have better, more accurate or more ethical, positive, beneficial theology. Today is about that critical look. And so when Bennett goes back to the original Swiss brethren, one thing to note that Dr. Mast notes in this article as well is that the Swiss brethren weren't perfect themselves. Menno Simons would later, Menno Simons, I think, had critiques of the Swiss brethren. Another early Anabaptist, Pilgrim Marpecht in Switzerland, he actually had significant critiques of the Swiss brethren. He did not view them as this hallowed, perfect group. He was concerned that they had become very rule-based, very harsh, very stern, and in some cases overcorrective. So I remember reading that, looking at the clergy abuses and the whole pedestal that the clergy have put themselves on, the Swiss brethren very much emphasized congregational leading. They did have leaders, and the problem was that they were so concerned about clergy abuse that the congregations themselves were actually abusing and being too harsh towards those they had appointed as leaders. They were literally overcorrecting, I think, which everybody has a tendency to do, and that is why some other Anabaptists like Pilgrim Marpecht were calling them out on it and pointing out where they were where they were wrong and being harmful. But let's just read this section here called Anabaptist Exceptionalism from page 79. So this is what Dr. Gerald Mast writes. Anabaptist exceptionalism is the idea that Anabaptism is a more perfect third way beyond Catholicism and Protestantism that fully restores the teachings of Jesus Christ and the practices of the early church. In this view, Anabaptist churches like the Mennonites, the Amish, the Hutterites, and the Brethren are exceptions to the corruption of the rest of Christendom. The rest of Christianity supports war, but we are non-resistant. The rest of American Christianity is individualistic and selfish, but we are all about community and service. The rest of Christianity is forgotten about the way of Jesus Christ, but we have made Jesus the center of our faith. Much of the academic study of plain Anabaptist communities fits into this exceptionalist model by painting Amish and conservative Mennonite communities as somewhat utopian islands of happy separation from the iniquities of late capitalism. This exceptionalism sometimes gets attached to highly specific cultural markers, such as the ability to sing in 4-part harmony without accompaniment, or to establish extended family relationships such as second, third, and fourth cousins in casual conversation, otherwise known as playing the Mennonite game. There are many problems with exceptionalism. Perhaps the worst is the inability to admit an exceptional community's failures. For example, admitting that Mennonite communities include the sins of abuse and violence or complicity with nationalism and white supremacy undermines the narrative that Anabaptist beliefs and practices are a more perfect third way featuring peaceable discipleship and nonviolent resistance. Wow, this is spot on. What is really identified here is the idea, first of all, that Anabaptists were this Christian group that stood apart from all the sins of Christendom. And I mean, I tend to have a view that the theology indeed was subversive, that was rethinking, that was kind of like deconstructing in its own time, that was about pursuing Jesus's way and pursuing a more faithful interpretation. But the problem is that Anabaptists were not the only ones who believe this. And secondly, the problem is that if you hold to one thing in your mind, that Anabaptists are like exceptional in their theology and in their communities, they do have unique elements in the communities that can be valued, such as, four-part harmony singing or whatever it is. There are unique things in the communities, but if you believe that there is this exceptional, special thing about Anabaptism, it makes it very hard to, on the other hand, actually be aware about and admit to and recognize the sins of, and this is so well said, the sins of abuse and violence or complicity with nationalism and white supremacy. So these two things, and I think I will save sort of nationalism, manifest destiny, empire building part for another day, but I will comment that even ex-Anabaptists, even people who are not at all conservative, not at all plain anymore, and who I think are probably much more sort of progressive liberal Anabaptists in the spectrum, take exception to when different scholars, not just me, there are scholars in Canada, Dr. Jesse Yum in Canada has talked about the fact that Anabaptists were actually pretty silent on things like the stealing of land from indigenous peoples. So Dr. Yum mentions in her article that there was a time when the Canadian frontier was being opened to settlers, and they literally sent a notice to Europe, to Mennonites in Europe, saying, we would like you to come and settle land, and I quote, recently cleared of either native or inhabitants, or, basically, we have just removed all the people who have been inhabiting this land, and we would like you to come and farm. And what Dr. Yum basically points out is that there are ways to do violence without actually getting your hands dirty. Somebody else does the violence for you, and you benefit from that. And as we look into empire and empire building, empires are built, wealth, industry, territory, agriculture. Empires are not only built just through war and through the military. Empires are built as a society. That's how, empires gain global dominance. And so Anabaptists have participated in the building up of empires. And I mean, if we look at it scripturally, the early church were under empire when they farmed, when they did their trade, as they lived and ate and did things, they were immersed in the world of empire, and that was a world built on war and slavery and violence, a lot of violence and evil. And I think there is this thing that, yes, you cannot be separate. Like, you cannot withdraw yourselves from the world to live on an island where you have no complicity in empire. We're all entangled in empire, physically, which is what makes it so insidious. Spiritually, we have been brought from the power of Satan to God, and from the kingdom of the world to the kingdom of Christ. Yes, that all is true, but in reality, physically, Jesus said, I don't take them out of this world. And so historically, Anabaptists have, in many ways, benefited from empire, benefited from the land that was stolen. I mean, all of it was stolen. I mean, that's what basically it is. Some of it was whatever. There's a lot of history about land acquisition, but settler colonialism, for example, is the logic of replacement, whereby the settler community essentially embarks on a cultural and physical genocide, as well as a replacement of an elimination of indigenous peoples, people who have lived in the land and who have been who the land and it belongs to you. Like, you basically go in and clear people out and replace them, and that's settler colonialism. So there is a lot to talk about there. I could invite a guest to talk about that in a future episode. And yes, Dr. Mass is absolutely right, and I have found this in my research as well, that part of the logic of settler colonialism, especially with regard to European colonization, has been white supremacy, because colonialism was built on the very creation of this concept called race. Race is not just a neutral designation, it actually is inherently a system designed to benefit some people and to enslave other people, to dehumanize other people. Essentially, racism created a distinction between the human and the subhuman, the animalistic, that's what, and it is sort of like, and definitely was manifested in Hitler's violence in the Holocaust, where he created this racial designation. And through that, even though it was an invented concept, did tremendous harm and tremendous evil. It killed millions and millions of people. And it's the same thing. Hitler basically took the colonial concept of race and he just applied it within Europe to create hierarchies of different European peoples, which, I mean, had already, some of these prejudices had already been in existence. He simply turned it into policy, into a national ideology. But that's what settler colonialism is. It's embedded deeply in the invented concept of whiteness and white supremacy. And so that is really something to dig into, that I'll get into in a future episode. But today we'll be talking about abuse and violence, and the fact that it becomes very difficult for people to, on one hand, recognize, or on one hand, to really, like, for me personally, to really identify with and to find something in Anabaptist teachings that really speak to my heart, that really, looking at the history of Christian violence, Christendom, the Crusades, colonization, everything that happened in Christian history, and just all that violence, the fact that somebody out there is advocating for peace theology, that's very important. That is essentially necessary. A church that opposes stealing, killing, and destroying, that holds fast to the way of the kingdom, that holds fast to the example of Christ, that's really, really important, and we need to have that. I think possibly one solution to taking away that sort of illusion of Anabaptist exceptionalism is to recognize that this is something that is just what Jesus taught. That is something that is essential to the faith, that all of us are called to. Anabaptists might have been really, really helpful to me personally in like expressing that in words, in setting, some of them really setting an example for that. I literally have like Dirk Willems here on my wall, and Anna Jans, and two different people from the Martyrs Mirror who really stood as an example. we have that manifestation, we have that expression of it, that articulation of it, but any Christian reading the Bible and following Jesus should have this. It just so happened that it's useful because this particular group, I guess, enunciates it. But an enunciation is not exceptional, because they're not the only Christians who teach and believe this, like the early church literally did too as well, at least many of them. They weren't exceptionally perfect, they weren't exceptional in their beliefs, but they are helpful in articulating and in living out this concept. So in my mind, yeah, we have to hold these two things, that peace theology is really, really important in the world of empire, in a world of not just violence, but violence done in the so-called name of Jesus, violence done by Christians to build a church hand in hand with missions and evangelization. All that happened. And so to try and separate that is extremely difficult. And so two kingdom theology, nonviolence really helps to bring clarity into the confusion and the disillusionment you have realizing, looking at church history and going, oh my, how can I be a part of something so evil that manifested itself in so much violence? And then some people come along and say, well, that wasn't Jesus, that was disobedience, that was sin, that was evil. And I think it only just takes a follower of Jesus to recognize that. So again, Anabaptists are not exceptional, but to hold that thing in one hand, to hold the helpfulness of the Anabaptist testimony, the Anabaptist witness, together with all the complexities and harms and all that together. To recognize Anabaptists are not perfect, they're not exceptional, they're not unique, they're just as flawed as everyone else, but they are helpful to us. And on the other hand, to also recognize abuse and violence and complicity in the communities themselves. So rather than expressing it in my own words, I'm going to read to you a couple of quotes from different Anabaptists who have experience, particularly in North American Anabaptist communities, which is where most of the peace theology is being articulated. Now, interestingly, and I'll go into this in a future podcast, but according to a survey done by the Mennonite World Conference, North American Anabaptists hold to like some of the fewest, or like percentage-wise, in the terms of a metric of who actually holds to nonviolent convictions, North American Anabaptists are way behind apparently their Asian and African and Latin American counterparts. If I remember correctly, there's some complexity to the statistics, but basically, Global South Anabaptists, even though we are not hearing from them, they're not like the loudest voices. They're not the ones writing the books about peace theology. As a community, as congregationally, they tend to hold to nonviolence stronger, and as a larger percentage than North American Anabaptists. And European Anabaptists, basically, for a long time, they haven't believed in nonviolence at all, for a very long time. I mean, this is very generally speaking. We'll talk about this. We'll talk about Global South Anabaptism in another episode. But the fact that the loudest voices, the ones doing all the publishing and writing and theologizing, that isn't necessarily representative of the communities. Okay, so I'm just going to read aloud from this article that I had written previously. Peace theology has an abuse problem, and it's not just among conservatives. Deep within the established framework of Anabaptism lies an undercurrent that of enablement of abuse, whether by D.H. Bender, John Howard Yoder, Bruxy Cavey, the perpetrators of sexual abuse, as documented in the documentary Sins of the Amish, or the dozens of recorded cases of leaders who have misused their positions on the MAP case list. So pausing here, I think Mennonite Abuse Prevention MAP website, it basically has a record of verified cases that have gone to court of Anabaptist leaders from all kinds of denominations. Literally everything from like horse and buggy all the way up to like super progressive liberal groups. And these are abusers in leadership. And there's a list of them. Anyway, continuing. It shouldn't surprise us that a man-made formulation can fall short and end up doing harm. Every single description or articulation of theology is a human endeavor. It is subjective, imperfect, potentially dangerous if exalt it beyond the story of its flesh and blood creators and make it into unqualified universal truth. This does not make me less of an Anabaptist. I simply recognize that Anabaptism as it is not perfect. At best, Anabaptism points us to the person of Jesus. There are many Anabaptisms, including Munster, and none of them were thundered down from Mount Sinai. So I reviewed a book. I will put a link to the review to the book by Mary Byler, who is a survivor of sexual abuse in the Amish community. And I'm going to give this example, and then I'm going to give an example from a far more like different liberal Mennonite group. So this is what Mary Byler said. My mem, her mother, said, to forgive means he's sorry and you can never talk about it. If you do, your sin may be as big, if not bigger than his sin. My mem encouraged me to forgive him and endorsed me sitting on his lap even after I told her of his abuse. I didn't have the words then to describe that I was terrified of my dad, and even when I talked about it, no one would hear me. And then after that, when Mary was raped hundreds of times, admittedly, by Johnny, Mary's brother. Mary tried to like speak up about it. They tried to go for it, like ask for help. It was constantly being silenced by the mother, by the community, to the point that finally when Mary left the community and went to court, there were hundreds of Amish people who showed up to support the rapist and who were there against Mary, who apparently was unforgiving. And so we know about stories of Amish forgiveness, and that's almost like capitalized on. There was literally a movie made about the nickel mine shooting, and all the Amish believe in unconditional forgiveness. No matter what anybody does, no matter how terrible, they believe in following the teachings of Jesus to forgive them. And so we only hear about nickel mines. We don't hear about Mary Byler's case. And literally, there was a recorded admission by Johnny Byler. He stood up there and he openly admitted, and yet every single Amish person in the courtroom, busloads of them from Pennsylvania, from all over the US, none of them was supporting Mary. All of them were condemning her, ostracizing her, shunning her, and they were there to support Mary's rapist, who apparently had repented. So that's the story, and part of it is in Reflections of an Amish Misfit by Mary, and part of it is in Sins of the Amish. And there's literal videos, and it's so horrifying, is just from like a Christian perspective, to see a whole courtroom of people who call themselves Christians and who believe in following Jesus, who support the rapist and not the survivor. And I mean, this is something Rachel Denhollander or Jacob Denhollander on Twitter said recently, that almost in every case, the first thing pastors like they will come out to support the abuser. And I think, I don't know whether it's them or someone else said, the first thing pastors will say when they hear about any case of sexual abuse often is, how can we help the abuser? How can we reach out to redeem, save, forgive, rescue the abuser? There isn't that concern for the victim of sexual abuse. Okay, this is a testimony. I'm going to read out loud a testimony from an MCUSA pastor, ex-MCUSA pastor. MCUSA is the most liberal Mennonite denomination. So I really want to show you, like, this is not just horse and buggy people. This is someone in a progressive group, and he says, sexual violence happens across the board, regardless of denomination or theology. However, the particulars and dynamics are often specific to the particular theology and group. This isn't just a conservative Mennonite problem, but also a liberal one, where the patriarchal dynamics may not be as pronounced. Not only are girls not taught to stand up for themselves, but we also have a theology that doesn't handle conflict very well, where the emphasis on peace sidelines the necessity of conflict sometimes. On top of that, the mythologizing of martyrdom often leads to the silencing of victims with an emphasis on suffering like Christ. I once saw someone argue that since Christ loved his enemies, an abused spouse should love her abusive husband. One of the worst comments I ever heard at an MCUSA convention was a public argument about how the church should be a place for both the perpetrator and the baby he abused. It was really tone deaf. Mennonites often seem to see violence as something that is outside or separate from us. I don't often see the critical lens except by sexual abuse advocates. Violence is something that somebody else does rather than something that we as the kingdom of God are capable of doing ourselves. All groups have to deal with sexual violence, but it often has particular distinctives in Mennonite groups that have been shaped by our theology, and I don't see a lot of critical reflection about that. So I'm going to read out loud, looking at these two things. Just hold that in your mind. I'm going to read out loud from the Sermon on the Mount. And ask yourselves, taking this absolutely literally with no qualifications, what would this look like in an abuse situation? You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also. And if someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to him who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. So this is Matthew 5, verse 38 to 45. Now you can say we take this plainly, we take this literally. So someone, let's say they have no knowledge about abuse advocacy. They have no knowledge about how abusers manipulate anything, right? Somebody's in a domestic violence situation and they hear this and they read it. What does this verse, way that we are reading it, tell them? This verse says, do not resist an evil person. Do not demand an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. If your abuser strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also. Give to your abuser what your abuser asks you, and do not turn away. Love your abuser. Pray for him who persecutes you or her, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. This is what the verse is telling them. This is what it literally says. So either Jesus is teaching us something that is bad, or we are reading it wrong. Now, I'm a Christian, so I believe fundamentally that God is good. I believe that God will not teach us anything that will harm us. I don't believe, therefore, if God is good and Jesus is love, Jesus will not tell someone to turn your cheek to your abuser and say love your abuser and give them everything they ask of you and don't say no ever, because that's what it says. There's no agency to say no whatsoever in this passage. Like literally it says, give to him who asks you, and from him who wants to borrow from you, do not turn away. What does this mean? We forget who Jesus was talking to, where Jesus was talking. Jesus is talking in the context of empire, and he's clearly referring to empire. in the sense that what Jesus is referring to is how his disciples are to respond to a Roman officer who's trying to compel them to carry his pack. Because legally, a Roman officer can compel them to carry his, like any of their conquered subjects, Judeans, can carry your pack 1 mile. Jesus saying, go that 2nd mile. And Jesus is talking about persecutors. He literally says it right there. Persecutors, people who are out to do you harm, people who are of Satan's kingdom, who are of empire, who are of the world. And I think we really need to understand wise application and wise context, because it doesn't mean if somebody walks up to us and say, give to him to ask you, like if a rapist walks up to you and say, give this to me, I want this from you. Does it mean that you give it to them? Is this what Jesus is telling us, that like never say no? Is Jesus telling us just to quietly, like if your rapist wants one thing, give them to? No. But a lot of Christians have been reading it that way. I have written an article previously about how the fact that what Jesus is doing is giving the Judean subjects of empire, the people who are marginalized and oppressed by empire, he is giving them a way to resist. Now, there are 2 ways you can resist. One way is you can take up arms and you can fight back and you can resist and then you die. And that isn't any different because you're repaying evil for evil. So let's look at this passage, right? An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth can mean one thing can be pursuing like judicial revenge, but it can also mean you do violence to us, we will do violence back to you. You invade and conquer us, we're going to fight back. We're going to take up the sword, we're going to drive you out of our land, and we're going to claim autonomy for ourselves, Judeans, and we're going to fight for home rule and for a Jewish nation. That's one way. And there were revolts. There was a Bar Kokhba revolt. There were many other messiahs or leaders during that time who were similar to Jesus, who were promoting that, and that was their method. Jesus was a Judean, a Galilean, who was part of this oppressed people, and who was leader of some sect and group, right? And there were so many of those during that time. There were so many sects. And Jesus was advocating for a different method of resistance. Knowing that all those other groups and other methods of resistance were out there, Jesus was giving them a different strategy and saying, look, they come with swords. We don't have to go back at them with swords. Jesus is giving an agency and a way of resistance to marginalized people that does not imitate the way of violence, because the way of violence is harm, retaliation, harm, retaliation, and it's a cycle of violence and violence and violence and more violence. And as soon as one people conquers and invade another, if you retaliate and fight back, you probably do to them what they did to you. This is a political thing that's going on right here. You want to, the Old Testament full of this, like happy is the one who takes your little ones and dashes them against a rock. That is the sentiment in scripture. We see David calling for his enemies to be destroyed. Now Jesus is coming in and he's offering a different strategy. He's offering a different way of resistance, that instead of empire's way, which is stealing, killing, and destroying, what about a revolution, a resistance of peace, a revolution that does not mean becoming like the empire? Because once you become like them, what are you? And so this is personally what the gospel of peace means to me. It's like a different kind of revolt, a different kind of rebellion that constitutes a rebuke. This is what that passage is saying. In that context, in the context of Roman oppression, how do you, in the context of empire, how do you break out of that cycle of violence? You rebuke it by setting a straight path for a different way. And Jesus did set a straight path for that different way. He literally inaugurated it by dying on the cross. The cross was an act of Roman terrorism and violence designed to strike fear in any onlookers and be like, wow, this is what will happen to anyone who dare come against Rome. And then Jesus died on the cross. And that death was a symbol that the worst that empire can do to you, the most harm that they can do, the show of their might and their violence and their torture and just celebration of cruelty, you can turn that around and subvert it. And Jesus did that in the ultimate way. And honestly, Jesus did it once and for all. There does not need to be someone who redoes the very act of Jesus in, like, breaking the chains of empire. We're called to imitate Jesus, right? We're called to follow after him, but he has already done that work. We believe in the finished work of the cross. And so Jesus starts that revolution. Jesus inaugurates a way of breaking the cycle, stepping out of the way of violence, and finally ushering, like a breath of fresh air, ushering a way that no other person can usher in, a different way, break out of empire. And guess what? Jesus, in dying, his death, something that so-called the Romans took from him, his life, the Romans tortured him, penetrated, pierced, flogged his body. In that, he had power and he had agency. Jesus said, no one takes it from me. I lay it down of myself. 1 Corinthians chapter 1 says it was the wisdom and the power of God. This is what the cross is. It's the manifestation of power, of wisdom, and of agency, of choice. It's saying, you can take this from me, but I am the one who's actually acting. You can't actually take it from me. And that's why Christians, as under empire, were literally celebrating Jesus' so-called defeat by empire every time they broke bread, which we talked which will be in another episode. But every time they broke bread, it was a defiance of empire. And all of this is constituting a rebuke. So let's read this again in a different light. Let's read it in the light of a rebuke of empire to establish a new way of peace outside of empire, outside of Rome and every other empire's violence and oppression. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also. That is a rebuke. That is taking agency in a situation. The person who is striking you, the person who's demanding you go 1 mile, the person who wants to take your cloak from you, they are doing an act of violence. And what you are doing, what in the case of like a Roman centurion wanting to take your cloak, maybe it's your only cloak, he wants to take that from you, and he has every right to, and you are sort of the victim in the situation. You don't have agency in that situation. What can you do? I demand it, I take it, right? Jesus is showing these as an example, not as like a rule, right? Jesus is giving us the principle here, not something to be like rigidly interpreted. And that is the problem. We interpret the New Testament the way that the Old Testament law was misinterpreted. Sorry, like tithing, human, like reading it into like being petty and being persnickety and being like over fundamentalistic and literal in a very brainless and harmful way. Jesus is not giving us like the exact prescription. He's giving us the principle. We really need to understand that the Sermon on the Mount is the principle, because if we think that it's the prescription, literally people with less problems actually need to gouge out their eyes and cut off their hands. No. What is the principle? In a situation where something is being stolen from you, and this is in a political sense, by your persecutors, you take that active agency. You can have the agency to do something that's not just an act of violence in return. You can show them love, enact something peaceful, upset that violence, upset that cycle, change what's happening in that situation. And as you do that, it is two things. It is an act of agency, an act of choice, an expression of the heart. And so it cannot be prescribed And also, it is an act of rebuke. You're not necessarily like saying you're better than the person. It's rebuking empire. It's rebuking the way of Satan. It is a rebuke of evil itself. And that is how you rebuke and you resist it. You don't be a part. You don't be a part of it. You don't cave into it. You don't do that thing. You do a different thing. You show a new way, and it comes out of the heart. Like, I have Dirk Willems' picture up on the wall, and in that moment, it was the right thing for him to do because it came out of his heart, and it was what he chose to do right in that moment. Dirk Willems running away from his captors, turned around and saw the person pursuing him literally fall into the ice. In that moment, in that split second, as a new Christian, as like a 16 or 18-year-old, Dirk Willems decides to turn around and save him. And as he saves him, he's actually arrested. He saves someone's life, he's arrested, and he is literally burned at the stake. In that moment, that was the agency he had. He had the agency in that moment to run away. He had the agency to ignore the person who was dying, but he personally chose as an act of love to save somebody's life because he valued life and he valued that person. And he didn't see that person as a monster, as an enemy. He saw them as a person in need of help. That was all he saw. Yes, he died. But in that moment, the act of agency that you can have as someone who's following the gospel of peace is the principle. In that moment, we don't know what we will do. We don't know what the Spirit of God in us will call us to do. But this is not a prescription. When we make it into the prescription, that's how we get. When your abuser slaps, you turn the other to them. Give to your abuser what your abuser asks of you. That's not the point. Now, someone could say, someone could say, this is the point, like the harmful application is the point, and therefore nobody should be Christians. I don't see that, because I see that, like, this is resistance against the way of evil. This is resistance against the empires that have ruled the world for millennia. What other resistance is there but Jesus? What other resistance is literally the cross in the face of an empire ruled by the sword? So I do believe that God is good. I do believe that Jesus calls us not just to like a suffering, like miserable martyrdom type of thing that glorifies violence. Jesus calls us to turn away from violence to a different way, and in doing so, rebuke, resist. And in a way, this is a revolution. Now, let's look at an excerpt from a book called Liberating the Politics of Jesus. It's a book that has women from all around the world writing about different contexts, like in Colombia, South Africa, and apartheid. Women writing about peace theology. It's about renewing peace theology through the wisdom of women. And a lot of the book deals with the question of abuse. It is a book that involves theology, peacemaking. It is a really, really good reference book that I think should really be changing the conversation. So I'm going to read to you a little bit from this chapter here. Salvation for the Sinned Against by Lydia Gathman PG. And she starts by saying that Mennonite women are looking for an Anabaptist theology of salvation that takes them seriously as women and addresses their experiences of silencing, oppression, and violation, both in the church and in the world at large. This is page 148. What strikes me here is that, I talk about the gospel of peace. We talk about salvation. Episode 3 really went into how salvation is about being set free from that lust to steal, kill, destroy, dominate, harm. I think this is something that really addresses salvation in a new way, and it's especially now realizing that in the conversation about abuse and peace theology, that this is something that is needed. a quote, Anabaptist theology of salvation that takes us as women seriously and addresses questions like silencing, abuse, violation, etc. She says, currently our salvation theology primarily reflects the perspectives and questions of white men. Well, that's basically it. I mean, there's no one has perfect theology. No one human can come up with the perfect formulation. But in post-colonial theology, we understand that a lot of theology is written from the perspective of a colonizing culture. And within that culture, it's kind of like a closed loop. Almost every book of theology that we have is probably not from a woman and probably not from a person in the global South. And so our Bible, what we're doing is we are interpreting the Bible through the lens of only a small group of people, whereas the Anabaptist principle is really to have communal interpretation where everybody's voice matters, because God speaks to different people through how they walk with him. Our journeys shape our theology, and so we can't have only a few people's journey shape everybody's theology. In decolonial scholarship, Walter Mignolo calls it the master framework dressed in universal clothes. So God, we learn about God, we interact with Jesus through being his disciples, through walking with him. So we learn about discipleship from one another. And in that way, Romans 15 says we teach, we admonish one another, we encourage and we edify one another. 1 Corinthians 12 says, because we are one body and we need one another. And so what this author, Linda Peachy, is asking is the gospel also strong enough to save those who have been violated and desecrated? Do we believe God's love can also release and restore them? Well, and this is very true, like just thinking about it, so much of our theology is about those who do harm, which is why when an abuse case comes up, it literally, our focus is on the person who did the wrong, not on the person who experienced the violation and experienced the abuse, because that's not what we focus on in our theology. And if we look at the colonial history, that most people writing about theology and understanding salvation are from the perspective of those who did the harm, then we realize that we have become hyper focused on the people who do harm and not about healing for all of us when we experience harm. And this is something I talk about, like the gospel of peace and the healing of hearts. We think about the gospel as being the wrong things that we do and we're forgiven for them. But what about the gospel as bringing peace in our innermost being, healing, emotional healing? All of us have experienced some kind of emotional hurt, emotional harm. Some have experienced trauma. Why don't we think about this wholeness and healing as being part of the gospel when Jesus literally went around and healed people? That's insane that we don't think about it. Healing in terms of becoming whole. Okay, so I think that this passage here is particularly helpful. So we are turning to page 152. And she starts by saying that the goal was to create an alternative system and way of being, that is, with the gospel, that's non-hierarchical, that's caring, that's about sharing, that's about loving and serving. Okay, so let's start the quote. Sadly, the church has neglected to teach and practice these aspects of Jesus' struggle for and with subjugated people. It has ignored the ways he instituted alternative political and religious practices in opposition to the powerful interests of his society. By emphasizing instead Jesus' unconditional love and forgiveness, it has silenced victims and fostered meek submission to their suffering. Pause. You see, we misunderstand and we hyper focus on what Jesus's unconditional love and forgiveness means to abusers and people who do the harm. We do not talk about this means to somebody who is suffering. Often that's the case because the Western church isn't writing from a perspective of suffering, and therefore theologies that holistically understand suffering versus like fetishize it, versus create this unhealthy obsession with martyrdom to kind of compensate for a lack of suffering, that So I don't think the problem is Jesus' love and forgiveness. The problem is with our misunderstanding of it that causes us to quote silence victims and foster meek submission to their suffering. So here, the author quotes an example of a woman who experiences domestic violence. And this is the quote. Growing up Mennonite, I was taught early in life that we were called to be peacemakers in the world. I came to believe that in following Jesus' steps with God's love flowing through me, I could be a peacemaker and be instrumental in calming strife and conflict. But in our house, the problems would not be solved. His anger and criticism of me would grow. I would try harder to please him, but he would not be soothed. I was blamed for just about everything, and I got so that I accepted that blame. And then this is the author now writing. Even when her husband beat her so badly that she did not recognize herself in the mirror, she tried to forgive him as she had been taught since childhood. How many times did Jesus tell us to forgive? Did he say to forgive only if it was a minor offense? Of course not. So I would forgive, wanting desperately to believe that he wouldn't strike me again. I would try again to be a better Christian, to be a better wife. Sadly, the violence did not end until she finally sought help and refuge in a women's shelter. Personally, for me, what strikes me in this passage is that we think the Sermon on the Mount is talking about appeasement. We think that when Jesus says turn the other cheek, it's to try and appease and love and like be, how do you say, to like be obeisant and obsequious and just try to reach out to try to appease the anger of the abuser. Jesus did not tell us that we can appease our persecutors. Jesus did not tell us to turn the other cheek so they would stop beating us. Jesus gave an example of those things, and Jesus lived an example of those things on the cross as a way to really give someone in that situation the agency to express the kingdom way. But let's continue. Similarly, Leona Stuckey found herself caught at the age of 15 in a physically and sexually violent dating relationship. Despite her youth and the fact that she tried to leave the relationship, she ended up pregnant and was forced to confess sexual sin to a congregation as if she and this young man were equally guilty. Afterward, referring to a placard on her bedroom wall that read, "Love conquers all," she wrote, "I went home to hate myself, to feel the emptiness of ritual forgiving, to understand once for all that love did not conquer all. Tragically, there was no redemption or safety for her in her community, as the only apparent option was to marry this brutally abusive man who raped her and repeatedly threatened to harm her family." Clearly, these women needed salvation not primarily because of their own sin and rebellion against God, but rather because of the sin and violence of others. They needed love and support in order to escape the violence and encouragement to contest the systems and beliefs that excused and protected those who abused them. Unfortunately, the church has often ignored these realities and failed to take women's experiences seriously. Rather than leading to salvation, it has often increased their suffering and sense of bondage and shame. Indeed, several women in the focus group acknowledged that their times of greatest desolation happened in the church. One participant said, "Most of the traumas in my life are connected to the church." She went on to share that when she was a little girl, she noticed that all the language and all the leaders in the church were male. So she went to church So when she went to church, she played a game in which she clicked the left side of her head in order to become a boy so that she could belong to the words. Then she would click back at the end of the service. At that time, she had no concept that women were made in the image of God. These realities deeply affect women's perceptions of God and themselves and their ability to find forgiveness, freedom, and wholeness. The biblical concept of salvation is not primarily about dealing with individual sin and guilt. So something that strikes me from this passage is the phrase that says these women need salvation, not primarily because of their own sin or rebellion against God. And yet, if you come from the evangelical world, somebody would immediately come in and say, no, she's a sinner too. In a case of an abuse situation, I know even in a case of a woman who found that her husband was in adultery, the first thing she did was confess her sin. Because why? At any point when you are confronted with the sin of someone else against you, you are apparently supposed to confess your sin and level that sin and say, you are abusing me. I guess I'm being confronted with the sin, and therefore I must respond. The only a Christian way to respond is to see yourself as a sinner equally and too. Whereas in a situation of abuse, sexual abuse, we need to recognize that sometimes we need the kind of salvation that involves safety, that involves the good shepherd, that involves the healer, that we need this from Jesus. And yet we think that the gospel only tells just about everybody that they're sinners all the time, and you just have to keep acknowledging that all of sin falls short of the glory of God. All of sin falls short of the glory of God. Oh, somebody here in your church is taking advantage of children and grooming children. Well, all of sin falls short of the glory of God. If it weren't for the grace of God, there goes I. This is the weaponization of salvation language to enable abuse and to erase it. Essentially, that's what you're doing. If somebody comes against you in an act of violence and you say, well, I'm just as bad as you are, so what does that mean? That actually erases that violence. And now let's look at the article by Dr. Susanna Griffiths, who is an abuse survivor and a scholar of the New Testament, where she worked at the Anabaptist Mennonite AMBS Biblical Seminary, Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary. And she first starts by referring to Heston's College. Heston College is a Mennonite institution where about 100 years ago, one of the founders of the institution, D.H. Bender or D.S. Bender, sexually abused his daughter, who was one of the staff. The church's response during that time was to put them both under church discipline. Eventually, the daughter, the abuse survivor, she was actually fired or removed from the job. She was put under church discipline for literally being a victim of sexual abuse, as if she was party to it, as if she was guilty. And she eventually, she left. And yeah, so Heston has that history 100 years ago. Apparently now, with regards to sexual violence, there are allegations basically that have to do with victim blaming and trying to get victims to so-called reconcile with abusers. And Dr. Griffiths is referring to that. She says the college's mishandling of sexual violence reports and spiritual abuse of survivors under the guise of forgiveness and reconciliation matches my own experience in Mennonite institutions. From 2017 to 2022, I sought to end my abusive marriage. My ex-husband and father of my children trapped me in a cycle of violence, which began with physical violence and led to my expressions of a desire for divorce. He responded with suicide attempts and more physical violence. And then she says that counselors at the time told her she was in danger of a murder-suicide. And she writes, our situation stabilized after I decided that I would wait quietly to seek a divorce until I had finished my PhD and attained a tenure-track teaching job. She describes having support, financial support, food, friendship, groceries. She says there were ample sources of support from the highest levels of the AMBS administration and church. She continues, but there was a shadow side. I began receiving texts, calls, emails from people I knew in the local Mennonite community. One colleague offered marriage mentoring as the antidote to the separation. Another person with power over me told me he prayed we were, quote, working on our relationship, end quote. A spouse of a pastor told me she, quote, prayed reconciliation was possible. Other colleagues and fellow congregants told me I was damaging my children by choosing to leave. All these responses amounted to emotional torture, reeling as I already was from the guilt of leaving a man who claimed our marriage kept him alive and separating my children from living with their father on a daily basis. I told church leaders I desired to end the marriage. I was informed that my wishes reflected a perception skewed by trauma. Because my husband was repentant, there were no valid grounds for me to end my marriage. Instead, I was asked to participate in a months-long, quote, forgiveness journey before earning church support to end the relationship. And so she said that essentially what happened was, quote, the blame lay with me because my trauma, in my view, twisted my thinking. And she describes having the support of some, but also exhortations to forgiveness and reconciliation. She says, the spiritually abusive weaponization of forgiveness and reconciliation runs deep through the veins of Mennonite culture. These distortions of forgiveness and reconciliation, devoid of accountability or justice, figure into peace theology and hurt vulnerable people. It's time for Mennonites to own up to the violence that privileged peace theology does to survivors and victims. Pause here. And that's the thing. Peace theology, even when it is in the best of intentions, if it comes from a place that's not about suffering, but that comes from a place that does not involve suffering, but that fetishizes and idealizes suffering as a form of personal validation, it becomes extremely abusive, because then you fetishize suffering, and all the pressure, all the preaching puts this immense pressure on abuse victims to be the ones who are carrying peace theology and the validity of nonviolence and non-resistance on their backs. We are putting the responsibility to live out the ideals of a peace theology that fetishizes suffering on abuse survivors. And that is what is particularly so critically damaging in Anabaptist circles. So Dr. Griffiths is now writing a book, Forgiveness After Trauma, to unravel the violence of peace theology. The message is simple. Forgiveness does not mean that anyone has to stay in a relationship with their abuser. Reconciliation is the work of God, not the burden of survivors. I think that's very well written. She's not saying that there's no such thing as forgiveness and reconciliation. She's saying we are doing it devoid of accountability or justice. Personally, what I say is, like, we want to be wolf tamers for some reason. We almost like let the wolves run rampant because we've created a world and we've supported a world in which we aren't standing up to the forces of evil with our faith. And therefore, we realize that there's a lack of validity in that kind of faith that does not challenge empire. And as such, because we don't have that validity, we create that validity by fetishizing suffering. Just to go back, to summarize, there are elements of grooming in Mennonite circles, Anabaptist circles in particular, that really create this so-called quote predator's paradise that Mary Byler describes. And again, like I said, this is all the way from horse and buggy groups to extreme to the other end of progressive groups. So there's really like, you can't, we often like to, I think there's a lot of finger pointing, even within Anabaptist circles. Anabaptists like to point their fingers at Protestants and say, oh, the Protestants have got it all wrong. And then the very conservative, very plain Anabaptists will point their finger at the liberals and be like, stick it to them. They reject morality. They reject scripture. They reject the authority of God. And they don't have the truth. And then so they will point their finger, and then the progressive Anabaptists are pointing their finger at the conservative Anabaptists and the North and Buggy groups and say, you are all legalistic and patriarchal and abusive and oppressive. Well, guess what? All these groups pointing their fingers at each other. Nobody is blameless in this situation. No community is, and that is sad, but it also is a reminder that despite all that pointing of fingers, we need to look at ourselves as a community where we do harm to the least of these. Because Jesus said, whatever you do to the least of these, you do it to me. Because Jesus is the least of these. He became that for us. We don't have the mind of Christ. We're standing apart from the abused and the least and the last and lost. We distance ourselves from them, and then we put tremendous pressure on them. So the 4 things that I say are very dangerous that create an abusive environment. Firstly, separatism. The non-retaliation and rejection of worldly power predisposes victims of abuse, like sexual abuse, not to speak up, not to report, not to pursue justice, to hold perpetrators accountable. I would say this, it's like having a serial killer on the loose. It's not about your personal track record of how great you are and how wonderfully you can forgive an evil person. The fact is, you are not loving your neighbor if you let a serial killer straight up walk over to their house and harm them, or a sexual abuser harm those other people and those other children and not stop them. You are we pick and choose who to love, and loving someone is not enabling them to walk in somebody else's house and abuse their children or kill them. That we have to realize that there's something when it comes to sexual abuse. There's an extreme narcissism, there's a pattern to it, there's grooming, and in many cases it's just a repeated pattern where they will harm more and more and more people. And so this idea that we shouldn't speak out and that we should forgive as if that gives us a special crown on our head, rather than pursue safety. The Good Shepherd is all about safety. If our churches are not places of safety, they're not places of peace, they're not places of the gospel. Okay, second point. Forgiveness of one's enemies is taught consistently, which means that not only does the Anabaptist victim imbibe the message that God requires the forgiveness of their abuser, abusers know that their victims are more likely to have that spiritual pressure to forgive, forget, and remain silent. Thirdly, to not forgive and to not so-called reject the exercise of worldly power / revenge, so-called, as if holding a sexual abuser accountable is some kind of revenge. That's not what Jesus was talking about. This is considered sinful. Accountability is turned into sin and disobedience and a lack of spirituality. This means that the sin of the abuse in not forgiving and forgetting is considered equal to or worse than the actual abuse itself. This is what Mary Byler's mom said, and this is what so many people actually think. That if someone has confessed, admitted they're wrong, if you don't forgive them, you are just as sinful as the abuser. Which is so evil in so many ways. And fourthly, reconciliation is prized. It is seen as a success story to be trumpeted, which means that churches and leaders are motivated towards and often pressure victims towards a happy ending. This leads to manipulation by abusers and shortcuts. This is not reconciliation. This is not forgiveness. This because reconciliation and forgiveness requires the acknowledgement of wrong and taking responsibility. And this is something that I have said in a literal case where there was a like sexual assault that occurred. I said the perpetrator still wants to silence the victim, still ignores the allegations, and still wants to sweep it all under the carpet. The fact that there is no repentance, the fact that the victim is still being harmed, the fact that responsibility is not taken. I don't care how much so-called discipleship therapy, Christian sex addiction programs he has gone through. If he doesn't stand up and acknowledge his wrong to the victim and acknowledge that, and whatever it is, like maybe the survivor does not want to be contacted, that's fine, doesn't matter. But are they taking steps to even undo this abuse towards the victim? No. Instead, what the perpetrator did and often does is to get other people on their side to abuse the victim further, telling them, you're harming this person, you're not being forgiving, it was partly your sin, you're the one who caused it. They do all these things. If they're still doing all these things, if they're living in a lack of repentance and a lack of responsibility and accountability, they're not free. They're not free from the so-called sexual addiction that they want to characterize it as. So what I'm saying in this article, and you can go and read it, is that Anabaptists are using the lens and story of someone like John Howard Yoder, who is a serial sexual abuser, enabled by the people around him because he was a famous theologian. They're using the lens and story of John Howard Yoder and other Anabaptist luminaries to prescribe what discipleship looks like for every single Christian. It hasn't worked, obviously. It's not going to work. I'm not saying that we throw nonviolence and peace theology out the window. I'm saying that we have sold it short, that we have twisted it. We have taken violence and slapped nonviolence as a label on it. And we don't recognize abuse as violence. Nonviolence should literally mean being against abuse as well. And I think like a framework of this needs to really be scripturally, in the context of New Testament, in the context of Jesus's words in the early church, scripturally, this needs to come from an understanding of empire as the way of saying, going back to that previous episode. And there's so much agency. And personally, I struggle with the book of Revelations because it seems really revengeful. Like we have lots of martyrs, and that all the martyrs with their bloodshed, right? And they're calling out for God to just pour out all these bowls of wrath and their persecutors, and like how do we deal with that, right? As someone who believes in the Sermon on the Mount, but then realize the book of Revelations can be understood as agency for the abused and the persecuted. At least it's difficult to interpret. It's a book of like prophetic writing. Sure, it's difficult to understand, and it has so often been misused by people who are into exercise of power and militarism and revenge to be like, well, Jesus had a sword coming out of his mouth, and Jesus is all about, people who want that kind of vengeance and violence are people in positions of power. But really, because we read Revelations wrong, and I'm just realizing we read Revelations wrong because we're coming at it from a position of being embedded in empire and power and the sword, and we're using it to justify. Whereas Revelations in context was about the early church coming from a place of suffering, of having no agency, having choices, and even their very lives stripped from them. And this is a book that, at least if anything else, tells us that Christians have agency, the persecuted have agency, the abuse has agency, and God is not going to be silent about abuse. We see that the harm and the blood that was shed, God sees, and God is angry, because guess what? God's wrath comes from God's love. They are one and the same. We see that in Genesis chapter 9, where there's so much violence on the earth that God's heart is literally hurting, seeing all the violence. It's full of pain and regret, and God sees that. And God is angry because, like, if you see a woman who's like pregnant and then you see someone hitting her, how do you feel? You feel angry. You want to step in. You step in there. So that's what it is. we we're reading Revelations wrong. We're reading it from the perspective of empire rather than the perspective of the persecuted and abused. Just realize that. That's amazing. So I think we should end here. This podcast is long enough, and I started out wanting to have like a short podcast, and they're just getting longer and longer. But that's okay. These are conversations need to be had. I'm going to be having more conversations with others as well. There's like so many like flashing light bulbs for me, questions that I've been having, things that are starting to fall into place. So thank you for this opportunity to have these conversations. Please respond. Please contact me, especially on Twitter, through my Medium page, or through the Kingdom Outpost. We'd love to hear from you, and we'd love to have more of these rich, meaningful conversations, uncovering this gospel peace. The church is lost, even the peace churches need to discover this gospel peace. So I will see you all again next time. I know this has been a difficult conversation to have, with a lot of hard, gut-wrenching things that we've talked about here, and truly the weight of it cannot be underestimated. But so I pray that this has been edifying for you to listen to, and I'll see you again soon.